So Jean LaRose is a Lokono Indigenous rights activist from Santa Rosa Village, Maruka. She has dedicated her life to protecting Indigenous lands and cultures. As a key figure of Guyana's Indigenous movement, Jean LaRose played a crucial role in the creation of the National Tushaus Council and securing constitutional rights for Indigenous peoples. That's in the 2000 Constitutional Reform Commission. Currently a leader at the Amerindian Peoples Association, she continues to fight for the rights of Indigenous communities against ongoing threats. Her work has earned her international recognition, including the Goldman Environmental Prize. Jean will speak on the right of Indigenous peoples to organize and participate in decision-making processes. I give you Jean LaRose.
Thank you, Graham, and thanks everyone. And unlike the previous speakers who spoke primarily on climate change and issues surrounding that, I will talk a bit on Indigenous people's right to organize and to participate in the decision-making processes, primarily using the Amerindian Peoples Association's experience of how we have participated, but also how this is being severely threatened by the current situation of today, current political situation. I wish to begin by citing 3 articles from the Constitution, and I have made a written presentation which I'll go through for you. Article 146.1 says, except with his or her own consent, no person shall be hindered in the enjoyment of his or her freedom of expression. That is to say, freedom to hold opinions without interference, freedom to receive ideas and information without interference, freedom to communicate ideas and information without interference with his or her correspondence. Article 147.1 says, except with his or her own consent, no person shall be hindered in the enjoyment of his or her freedom of assembly, association, and freedom to demonstrate peacefully. That is to say, his or her right to assemble freely, to demonstrate peacefully, and to associate with other persons, and in particular, to form or belong to political parties, trade unions, or other associations for the protection of his or her interests. Article 149C says, no person shall be hindered in the enjoyment of participating through cooperatives, trade unions, civic or socio-economic organizations of a national character in the management and decision-making processes of the state. All of these speak to participation and certain basic freedoms of participating in national life as well. So you might ask, why do I choose to quote these parts of the Constitution? Allow me to provide some background into the work of the APA and why these provisions remain important to us as Indigenous peoples and as Guyanese as a whole. In 1991, the AP was born out of what some Indigenous leaders saw as a need for a body to represent Indigenous people's concerns that were not being addressed by the government of the day. And I'm speaking about 1991 here. Around that time, the government had signed a contract with the Barama Timber Company, and Indigenous communities in the location of its operations were feeling the brunt of that agreement in relation to their land tenure, among other things. It was a period where there were many struggles by Indigenous communities throughout Guyana, not only for land rights, but sometimes simply the right to food and sustenance. And so, out of a loose grouping of concerned Indigenous people, the APA came to be. Without fail has been working with Indigenous communities from then on to now. You might want to know, what has the APA been doing, or what have we achieved as an organization? The APA has always been an Indigenous rights and advocacy organization and has therefore primarily pushed for policy and legislative reform, where those that existed were inadequate to protect Indigenous people's rights, or where entirely new ones needed to be put in place. In order to understand these and other legislation and policies, we have consistently worked with Indigenous communities so that they understand the background of such policies and legislation, or the precedents that can be emulated. In the last constitution reform process in the early 2000s, an APA representative sat on the 20-member Constitution Reform Commission as the Indigenous Peoples representative in a process that saw Indigenous people being recognized in the preamble of the Constitution, where a new article, Article 149G, was included to protect the ways of life of Indigenous peoples in Guyana, where the Indigenous Peoples Commission came into being after there was an ungranted request for an entire chapter to address Indigenous peoples' rights. The National Tushaus Council is also mentioned for the first time, and the protections on environment took into account Indigenous peoples as part of this environment. All of these happened because of Indigenous peoples' participation in a process that allowed that. There is a current movement for reform of the Constitution. Who participates in this process? How does the participation take place? I urge you to take a close look into that. The AP also played a key role in the calling for the revision of the 1976 Amerindian Act leading up to its passage in 2006. As is evidenced by calls today for further revision of the Act, the 2006 Act fell short in some regards in fully protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples of this country. In May 2003, the AP also played an important role in the formation of the National Tushaus Council. Graham mentioned that earlier. The AP has also advocated for Indigenous rights to be respected, whether it is in the building of roads or hydropower dams, the establishment of protected areas that Kyle just spoke about, and other conservation projects, in the extractive sector in relation to gold and other types of mining, and in many other ways where Indigenous peoples' rights could be negatively affected or compromised. And there have been many of these, in fact. All of our work has been guided by the needs and requests of Indigenous peoples and their communities. So how did all of this happen? In order to ensure that the organization was truly representing the requests of communities and the people who constantly sought support, the APA held capacity building rights and related workshops, conferences, meetings, and other forums and gatherings with communities throughout Guyana. These have not been one-off gatherings over a few hours, as we've seen some consultations happen, but have happened over time and repeatedly, as understanding policies and legislation can sometimes be complex and time-consuming. We also reach out to other partners, policymakers, and foreign missions, among others, with an interest in Guyana's Indigenous peoples, but our work with the communities carried the bulk of our attention. As a result, our outreach and presence in these communities expanded, and we feel that this benefited them in many ways. From its inception until now, the AP has always focused on promoting, protecting, and preserving the rights of Indigenous peoples, and have followed closely international standards and mechanisms such as those offered by the United Nations. For example, the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the OAS Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights Processes, among others. And we have used these, and I would say use them effectively as well. Except for changes to reflect the changing times, our work has remained constant, working with communities to understand the request for policy and legislative support, planning and implementing based on requests for such support, seeking to promote community dialogue with government and state officials, and building relationships with international agencies and partners so that they understand the work of the organization. Our work has never been political and has generally focused on the Indigenous human rights aspect of rights issues. But for a while now, especially more recently, if you have been following the news involving Indigenous people, you may have noted that our work is now openly being challenged and undermined, with even personal attacks being made on individuals who work with the APA or who support the work of the APA. We have been bullied, harassed, ridiculed, and called names, mostly by leading politicians. We have been labeled as obstructionists and anti-development, as being political, or as being part of the opposition, or even being in bed with them. We have received reports of party operatives in communities repeating such stories because our people tell us back these stories. We have also had reports of meetings in villages by officials warning persons against collaborating with the APA. We know that Indigenous village leaders were repeatedly told similar stories at the recent National Tush House Conference. The APA played a major role in the mouths of some politician during the 5 days of the recent conference. The name-calling and untruths have been repeated at the weekly press conferences of Guyana's vice president. The question is, why is the APA being singled out for this sort of treatment? Why are people being told not to talk with the APA? Why are people afraid to be seen in the company of APA personnel? Why are even people being called out for the color that they wear? I say, as we have said before, the APA is not a political organization. The APA is not the opposition. The APA is not anti-development. Just as our leaders have been saying, the APA wants development for our communities. We want better and more education and health facilities in our communities. We want improved transportation services. Those of you who travel between Georgetown and the hinterland would understand what the services that we have to deal with. We want top-of-the-notch sports facilities. We have heritage games taking place right now. How many of us have coaches for cricket teams or volleyball teams or football teams or swimming teams? How many of us have facilities? We want all of these things in place so that we are able to participate on equal footing with those who have more than we have in the communities. We want our lands properly titled and demarcated. We want a resolution of existing land conflicts. We want so many other things that our communities need to improve the conditions of our people generally. So how can you say we are anti-development? We want all of these, but we also want adequate policies and legislation in place that protect our rights and livelihood in all regards. We can have the material things, and they can be piled upon us, the roads, the schools, infrastructure. What happens to us if we do not have legislation in place that protect our land rights, that protects our patrimony? We want that our people have the right to govern themselves, free from fear of intimidation, favoritism, bullyism, manipulation, and harassment. We want to exercise our freedom to associate and to represent, as our Constitution provides for, without fear of prosecution or of being bullied, ridiculed, or intimidated. I end by saying, where is the democracy that our president speaks so often of? Listen to our voices, I plead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. LaRose.